I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. The recent conflict in the Middle East has brought global attention to the use of advanced missile defense systems in the region. Israel's system is known commonly as the Iron Dome and uses this kind of technology to protect itself against rocket fire launched from neighboring countries. The U.S. is also providing support in the missile defense system. Even with American support, what are the limitations of Israel's Iron Dome? And what other military systems are available to intercept and shoot down long-range missiles? Global security expert Wes Rumbaugh is here this week to talk about how this defense technology works and how the U.S. and its allies defend against missile attacks. Wes, thank you for joining us.
My name is Wes Rumbaugh. I'm a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the Missile Defense Project. I'm curious about air and missile defense, and in particular, sort of many of the budgetary and procurement questions that sort of inform the questions of the defense industrial base and inventories, and providing additional data to discussions about the question of air and missile defense inventories.
And what are interceptors?
Yeah, so interceptors would be the missiles that are used for intercepting something that flies through the air. So some of them use various means to run into the target, if you will. Some of them have blast fragmentation warheads, so a proximity fused warhead that will explode at a designated time, and that creates sort of more of a broader based effect. And then certain missile defense interceptors will also use what's called hit-to-kill technology. So that sort of leverages the physical force of the interceptor missile and then collides directly with the either incoming missile or reentry vehicle as the incoming missile is coming in. So that's sort of a more precise. It's obviously sort of been described as the ultimate precision guidance challenge because you have to hit the missile directly. It's often been described as hitting a bullet with a bullet, but it's something that allows for a greater, easier battle damage assessment, so you can more quickly assess whether or not you've hit the target or not, and then whether or not you have to fire more interceptors.
Can you describe the Israeli Iron Dome in more detail and what that is? It's been in the news more since the war in Israel, and tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the Iron Dome system was developed more as a rocket interception system. So it's a system designed to be able to intercept sort of short range rockets. And so missile defense systems are often kind of are more easily categorized based on the types of threats that they're designed to counter. And so Iron Dome sort of falls in the lowest tier of interceptors or missile defense systems in terms of it's designed to be able to intercept rockets, short range missiles, and maybe like smaller cruise missiles would be I would say the range of threats that it's designed.
What does it not intercept?
So, for example, the larger scale attacks from Iran, where you saw in early October the larger number of long-range ballistic missiles that were fired from Iran, those would not be intercepted by Iron Dome. Those would be intercepted by higher tier weapon systems like the Arrow missile defense system, the David Sling missile defense system, and then the U.S. also contributed to that defense with its Aegis ballistic missile defense system, which uses the Standard Missile 3 interceptors. So that's like the specific variant of the interceptors based on the Aegis ballistic missile defense system is based on U.S. air or destroyers, particular naval class of ship.
So the U.S. destroyer ships are located in different locations, and probably they have to be nearby Israel to protect them?
They have to certainly be deployed overseas. The U.S. has deployed a number of those destroyers to the Red Sea for a considerable part of the last year as part of its deployments to attempt to provide. So the role of the destroyer in the naval fleet is anti-air warfare. So the ability to intercept aerial threats to the rest of the fleet. So, for example, when the U.S. deploys a carrier, the big aircraft carriers that have all of the planes on top of them, it will also have destroyers as part of what's called an action group or a surface action group. Their role is to provide air-based defense to that carrier. And so destroyers can also be deployed independently in that role to provide defense for land-based targets like Israel. In military systems, there's always a codependency amongst all of the parts. The large part of the point of the deployments of the U.S. destroyers is to send a signal that the United States is willing to protect the sort of international rights of navigation through international waters. And so, an important sort of role and mission of the United States Navy is protecting freedom of navigation across international waters.
Going back to the Iron Dome, so reading it in the news, it gives a sense of, that there's a lot of protection. Even in the name, it sounds very kind of, safe.
I think that that's sort of one of the great misconceptions about air and missile defense. It's not a perfect dome or perfect protection system. Obviously, the scientists and the engineers that work on these systems, they work to make them as effective as possible. And I mean, it is like a technological marvel how effective they've made these systems at sort of hitting a bullet with a bullet and being able to intercept air and missile threats going at incredibly high rates of speed. But they're not perfect. And the interceptors do have, limitations in terms of their range and their ability to maneuver and anything like that. And that's also true of the missiles that are coming in. We talk about the accuracy of, so when we're talking about Iron Dome, we're talking about, Hamas or Hezbollah are firing, like old Soviet Katyusha rockets. And some of these aren't the most reliable of systems. And I think that we've even seen some examples of some of the unreliability of those rocket systems. And so that can produce inaccuracy. And so one of the primary challenges for the Iron Dome, because, you're shooting a lot of these rockets, the system has to process which ones are actually threats to areas, like civilian areas where there's higher concentrations of population versus things that are going to land in the middle of the desert or things that, and so you don't want to waste an interceptor on those. And so the tracking and command and control problem with those is a significant component of the effectiveness of those systems. Sometimes the most effective missile defense shot is not taking one because that's a missile or a projectile or a rocket that isn't going to have a significant effect on either, what you're trying to defend.
So what you were saying about how there are these other systems that are adding to the Iron Dome and like the higher tier or the Arrow, the David Sling, are those also Israeli programs?
Yeah, so both Arrow and David Sling are Israeli programs. They're cooperative development programs. So the U.S. has provided assistance. There's a United States Memorandum of Understanding on missile defense cooperation, and it's a missile defense cooperation with Israel on technology that's happened since the 1990s. The higher tier systems have become more necessary as, in particular, back in the day, the question was Saddam's Scud missiles that were targeting Israel. And then now, as Iran has developed its missile arsenal to become more sophisticated and longer range, what Israel sort of has created is a what we call a layered defense. There's layers of defenses against different types of threats that it faces, and missile threats that it faces. So it has the Arrow system for the longest range missiles in the Iranian arsenal. The David Sling system is sort of its medium tier. It's able to intercept like cruise missiles, maybe some short range ballistic missiles, and then Iron Dome is the lowest tier of that. And so you also there's also sort of a relationship between the tiers and just sort of the quantity of missiles. So as you might imagine, the longest range missiles are the most expensive, and so they're also the most scarce missiles. Uh, Going both ways, they're the most scarce missiles in the Iranian arsenal from a threat perspective, but also the most scarce missiles from an interceptor perspective. Whereas Iron Dome at the lower tier, the cheaper thing, and obviously the sort of short range rockets that Hezbollah and Hamas have been shooting are relatively cheap as as things go.
So, Putin, I think recently, maybe almost a month ago, had made a comment about hitting the UK with a ballistic missile in a non-nuclear hypersonic warhead. Is that a missile that's difficult to defend against for people that would have a missile defense system?
Hypersonic missiles are certainly not invulnerable wonder weapons, but it's an area in which internationally defense departments do need to invest a greater deal of research and development into creating new systems to be able to defeat these weapons. So there's, it's an area in which there are certain adaptations to existing air and missile defense systems that can be made to sort of create kind of interim solutions to intercept air and missile or hypersonic missiles. So we've seen, for example, the Ukrainians using the Patriot system, something that they've gotten from the U.S. to intercept what Russia has claimed is partially a hypersonic weapon of some sort. That's probably more of an aeroballistic missile. So it's a ballistic missile fired from an aircraft that creates some of the similar challenges to interception. But I guess the broader point is it's not an invulnerable weapon. There's some amount of work definitely needs to be done internationally by, the United States and its allies and partners to figure out the future for its hypersonic defenses and the specific interceptors that it wants to develop for the hypersonic defense mission. But there is residual capability inside of the current set of systems that it fields to be able to intercept these hypersonic missiles.
Tell me about what you find most interesting right now.
There's been a lot of debate about the responsiveness and discussion of the responsiveness and the readiness of the U.S. industrial base and the defense industrial base in particular. And so there's a lot of discussion about, unfortunately, we've had a lot of usage of missiles and air and missile defense missiles in international conflicts. And so that means that the discussion of, sort of the industrial scale production of those assets and the ability to replace those assets. And I think that the thing that I find most interesting, or the thing that I'm trying to work on most right now, is bringing in data to inform those discussions and what data is the most important to effectively inform those discussions. So there's the recent U.S. participation in the defense of Israel fired 12 interceptors, and there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction right now anytime that the U.S. Uses its missile inventories in any way. There's a knee-jerk reaction that, that'll sort of deplete the inventories to an unhealthy degree. I think that that's an important focus, but I think that it also needs to sort of have context about how many missiles are being procured in any given year. And so I'm trying to do research to sort of quantify the levels of production and bring a little bit more rigor to those discussions about sort of what the health of the U.S. defense industrial base in missile production is compared to other countries.
So, yeah, he wrote an article entitled, "Did the U.S. Defense of Israel from Missile Attacks Meaningfully Deplete Its Interceptor Inventory?"
Yeah, so what I did for that article was I sort of looked through, the U.S. budget documents have sort of the standard way of looking at inventory numbers is looking at some of the annual data on procurements. And a lot of people will generally only look at what the most recent year of procurements for a particular missile is to determine what the inventory level was. So for that article, what I did was tried to put that in context and bring together, because when you buy a missile or when you procure a missile, it doesn't go away. It doesn't leave the inventory after a year. These are long-term assets that will stay in the inventory for 15 to 20 years. And so I wanted to look at the procurement levels over a longer period of time than that to provide some additional. And then there was also some additional data that I looked at that's sort of buried a little bit farther in the documents and is kind of hard to work with. So it was a little bit more of a new data challenge there to look at some of the delivery schedules, because the question, when the U.S. buys a missile that Congress does eventually provide the appropriated funds, that doesn't mean that, the missile shows up the next day. The defense industry still it takes a couple of years to translate those dollars for the appropriated procurement into an actual delivered final missile. And so I looked at some of the delivery schedules to sort of talk about, the short-term deliveries for in 2024, 2025 are going to be relatively healthy, mostly related to the fact that those are delivering the procurements from fiscal year 2019, 2020, 2021. And so those were relatively more healthy years of procurement of Standard Missile 3s, which was the type of missile that was used in the Israel engagement. And so I looked at some of that data and thought that was interesting. It sort of poses some longer term concerns for the health of that industrial base. But that was a lot of what I looked at in that article, was providing a little bit of extra data there.
What would you say are the biggest challenges the U.S. faces in missile defense today?
I mean, the biggest challenges is just the question of, sending a consistent demand signal for air and missile defense, and then, being able to provide those orders consistently and honestly on time. So one of the, biggest things for air and missile defense, and I think that this is Department of Defense wide, is being more on time with annual appropriations. We have another continuing resolution going on right now. We're a couple of months into the fiscal year, yet again for fiscal year 2025, and we don't have a budget, and we don't have a finalized budget. And so all of the programs in the Department of Defense are having to spend based on last year's funding levels, and they're still uncertain about what their funding levels will be for 2025. So, I would say one of the biggest things that, and it's not just DoD, it's Congress as the appropriator has to be much better about appropriating on time for defense appropriations. And that would make, I think, it would make life a lot easier on all of these organizations. It would make it a lot easier for the defense companies to plan, because it's not just the defense companies, the large defense companies that are getting the prime contracts, but there are small components and small businesses that are their sub-suppliers, that these irregularities, they're operating on smaller margins. And so, there's very small specialized subcomponents that those companies are uncertain going into their fiscal year, what the order levels are going to be. And that provides a significant level of uncertainty sort of down throughout the supply chain.
It was so nice to talk to you today.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.